In today's video we will try to search for the answer to the question. Is there any kind of magic in Islam? To learn about and try to get an answer, let's dive a bit more into history. But before that, please do subscribe to my channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notification for the new videos. When it comes to magical practices in the Islamic good world, there is a whole lot to go through, of course, because we are dealing with a very wide span of time, about 1400 years at least, and of course a wide geographical area. As well, the word magic itself comes with a lot of problems. The closest equivalent to that word in Arabic is the word Seher, which also carries a lot of bad and negative associations. Sometimes we argue that we shouldn't call some of these sciences and practices magic, because magic can have these associations directly with demonic forces or to invoking things like the jinn rather than invoking God, which is what the majority of what in the broad sense what magic is doing in the Islamic world for most of history. But in any case, we will be using the term magic here in a general sense to talk about these things, including talismans and talismanic magic. In any case, various magical practices certainly took place and were common in the Islamic world during the Middle Ages, from the earliest periods after the life of Prophet Muhammad, and especially during the later Middle Ages around the 12th century. It became mainstream on a much larger level. The magical or occult practices in the Islamic world is hugely diverse. Of course, it includes many different techniques and sciences that in some way employ superhuman forces to influence the world. Now, the majority of quote-unquote magic in the Islamic world is protective in nature. It's magic that tries to protect oneself from the evil eye. It's a very common example to protect oneself from other magic, or indeed just from evil forces in general. But these things also worked in the reverse, in that actively helping someone, for example, gain good fortune or heal a sickness that they were inflicted with, or to attract a lover, perhaps a lot of different ways. These kinds of talismans could be employed. One sought these protective powers usually or almost exclusively from God, or sometimes his angels or other intercessory figures. One factor that differed magical practices in the Islamic world from other cultures before and after that, the majority of quote-unquote magic, although not exclusively of course, invoked the monotheistic God and his power rather than other superhuman forces. The way this worked was usually through various forms of talismans, so protective objects or amulets a lot of the time that were imbued with usually God's power that could help the person in various ways. In the Islamic world today, these kinds of talismans can very commonly be found in a Middle Eastern market or in the homes of people stemming from this region. We have seen the protective amulets against the evil eye that can be bought in bazaars in Istanbul, or seen the very famous and often beautiful hand of Fatima adorned. These are all examples of talismanic magic and has always been a major part of the culture in the Islamic world, even in a contemporary European or American context. How many times haven't we heard someone or seen someone have a lucky charm that they carry with them? This is the same phenomenon, something that exists across a wide span of different cultures, not just the Islamic world. But what is a talisman really, and how is one made? This is a fascinating topic, and luckily there is a lot of material from which we can draw to learn about it. During the Middle Ages, there were many books written which were either exclusively dedicated to or at least included sections about magical practices such as these. A whole epistle in their grand work specifically to Seher or magic, and two of the most famous grimoires or magical books in history written by the Andalusian Muslim and the Shams al-Ma'arif attributed to Ahmad al-Buni both deal with these very topics. Sometimes we find clear instructions on how talismans are made and what techniques to use for what talisman. Technically, it can be any object. You're probably thinking about some kind of necklace with a locker or something, and that can be one form of talisman. But a talisman can also be just a piece of paper. It can be a bronze bowl, as we will see, and it can also be clothes. These objects were imbued with power, so God's power usually, and the most common way of doing this was by imprinting certain symbols, writings, or images onto these objects. Some of the most common ways of turning an object into a talisman would be to write on it the names of God in Arabic. Primarily these are the names Allah, but one also finds other names like the Merciful or Al-Ahad, the One, etc. If not God himself, then one might write the names of one or more of his angels, such as Jibril or Mikhail. One can also write the names of his prophets, perhaps Muhammad, Moses, or Solomon. For many Shiites, one might also write the names of one of the imams or spiritual successors to Prophet Muhammad, very common. One also can write the Shahada or Muslim proclamation of faith, there is no God but God, or also direct verses from the Quran. Many verses. There was a lot of writing on these talismans. Words and phrases were the primary way that these objects were imbued with protective power. Many talismans such as these are often very beautifully adorned with Arabic writings, or in the case of Jewish practitioners, perhaps Hebrew writings. But there isn't just writing on these things, there are also various mysterious and esoteric symbols that are often imprinted in the earliest periods. We find an abundance of various figurative images symbols that probably carried over from pre-Islamic practice and symbolism. The earliest surviving talismanic objects reflect pre-Islamic magical symbolism, for example a longhorn stag or oryx occurring on very early Iranian amuletic objects for about the 9th century, and remarkably stable but complex design also occurring on 9th and 10th century amulets composed of a scorpion, rampant lion or dog, a canopy of stars and a frame of pseudo-writing. Later other symbols became more popular. A group of 7 magical symbols came to be widely used in talismanic magic and other magical instruction. These symbols were in some traditions thought to be the seals of various prophets, and taken together they also represent the seal of the Almighty or God. The most famous and widely used of these seals is the so-called Seal of Solomon. According to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Solomon, or Suleiman in Arabic, was especially associated with the esoteric and magic. If we define that word broadly, it is said that he was given a magical ring by God which had this special seal on it, and which allowed him to control the jinn and other spirits, as well as to talk to animals and understand their languages. Solomon is a central figure in the mythical history of Islamic occult sciences for this reason, and the symbol of his seal became a very important talismanic symbol and devised during the Middle Ages. It later also carried over into Europe and Western esotericism as well. Something known as magic squares. These were, as the name suggests, squares in which various numbers or sometimes letters representing numbers were written into separate columns. Big deal. You may think, well, the thing about magic squares is that they are always designed so that if you add up the numbers in any of the rows, whether horizontally, vertically or diagonally, you will always end up with the same number. These kinds of squares again were thought to be very powerful for magical purposes. The earliest and most popular form of magic square was the 3x3 variant, as it was obviously the easiest to make. The 3x3 magic square was also called by the name Budo. The Persian astronomer Abu Bajani, we find instructions on how to make these squares up to the most complex 6x6 variant, and they feature also in later medieval works like the Shams al-Ma'arif, one example of how these magic squares were used in medieval times. They were often used to help women in childbirth. So, particularly the 3x3 magic square would be written on a pot chart that had never touched water, very important, and then this chart would be placed in front of the woman's face, so that she could look upon it, and then the shard was also often placed beneath her feet. And this is very interesting because this practice is apparently very widespread in the Middle Ages. Significant example to show how widespread these kinds of practices were at that time. But as talismanic magic or objects could take many forms and be used in various ways, but all of which with the purpose of either protecting against something or to actively get good fortune in some way. There were talismans that could be carried with you in your pocket or around your neck. For example, there were even talismanic shirts like this fascinating object, the image of which was shared by one of my patrons by the name of Omar Abdullah. This talismanic shirt is, as you can see, covered in symbols and Arabic writings like Quranic verses. Other talismans were hung over the bed or the door of one's house. There were even some that were consumed to help with some internal problem or illness. In other words, there were talismans that could be swallowed. There were talismans that were carried with you. Before describing my conclusion, I want to mention one important thing, that this video is made for information purposes and takes notes from the history. There is no intention of hurting anyone's feelings. Please do subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon. Please don't forget to share, like and comment on my video. Your feedback is very important to me. According to all above examples and research, I can take a conclusion that in the early period of Islam there is no evidence of practicing any kind of magic or talisman or seher. As time progresses and Islam mixes with other cultures around it, it absorbs some practices from them. This is human nature, that something which can't prove fascinates him. This is what happens to the Muslim when they start researching on occult science and wrote books about it. These were very similar to the things which we have known as magic. When later Muslims found such research from their forefathers, they believed that it is legal in Islam, and they started inclined from it. In the modern world where knowledge is very much accessible to everyone, mostly modern Muslims claimed that Islam does not support the magic. I hope you like my findings on the topic. Thanks for watching.